So, as Matt has already said, Anthony is one of our friends, someone who's spoken at our conferences in the past. And it's my pleasure to welcome you warmly this evening. I feel very mixed feelings about tonight because I'm happy to see you, but I'm also very sad about the subject of the talk. 30 years since the murder of Stephen Lawrence. But thank you for coming to speak to us on that. For those who don't know Anthony, he is director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. His studies include, well, Black theology. This is one of the many books, Anthony, and liberation theology as well. I think what strikes me about Anthony is that he is an academic, and an academic who has a keen and deep interest in ordinary people and ordinary life and work and just everyday things. And especially he has an interest in those who are marginalized, who are oppressed or suffering in any way. And I think we must be very grateful to have someone with that combination of interests, academia and ordinary life. It is quite unusual, I think, and very valuable indeed. I think I'm right in having read one or two of the books in saying that Anthony sees God very much as on the side of suffering and sees the unequal world we live in as a challenge to us all. I think this evening we will be challenged, but thank you for coming. Thank you. And welcome.
Well, it's always good to be with friends who belong to Christians aware. I see you as fellow travelers, really, as we all seek to be faithful to God revealed in Christ. That I think is a command for us to be on the side of those who are the least of these, as depicted in Matthew 25, 31 to 46. What I want to do in this talk is to reflect on the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993. But I want to put it into a much bigger historical and theological context, because whilst his murder was obviously an example of extreme hate, and for the most part, that is not the norm in terms of what happens to Black and brown bodies, particularly in the UK. What I do want to say is that the reason why it happened and the reason why only 3 years ago, we had the murder of George Floyd in America, is that we still are working with an unresolved dynamic that goes back almost 300 years. And that dynamic is essentially this. If you remember nothing else from what I say in the next 25, 30 minutes or so, it's this, our fundamental problem is that we do not have an intrinsic value on Black life and Black bodies as being intrinsically of worth, that are not linked to notions of commodity, that are not linked to notions of us having no agency or no sense of internalized value in and of itself. Our value only comes when whiteness as a phenomena and white capitalism in particular sees us as useful. When we're not useful, then our value at worst diminishes, and in an absolutely worst case scenario, as in the murder of Stephen Lawrence, apologies for the slip, that intrinsically that we have absolutely no worth whatsoever. That may sound harsh, but what I want to highlight are just some of the ways in which that dynamic is still in play and we see in everyday discourse. I want to kind of bring this up to date. So this is not just about 1993 and Stephen Lawrence's murder, but it's, and actually it's not just about the murder of George Floyd only 3 years ago, but it's also about some of the debates we have around how we see British history and the place of particularly Black bodies within that history. So where to start? Well, let me start with what we often see as a celebratory moment, which is in August 1833, Britain declared the end of slavery. So an institution that had been in place for hundreds of years was declared at an end, and Britain was the first major country to set enslaved peoples free. And quite rightly, we celebrate that, and we celebrate the work of William Wilberforce and all the various people who were parts of this long journey towards arguing for the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. Now that is a significant place to start, because as I sit here, I am the descendant of enslaved Africans. That my name, Reddie, R-E-D-D-I-E, is my father's name, so I am largely committed to keeping it in honor of him. But it's a problematic name because it's not an African name. Actually, in my case, it's actually a Scottish name. So this goes back to the Highland clearances in the mid-18th century, so approximately about 1745, 1746, when the Scots lose their attempt to reclaim the crown and their independence from the Hanoverians, and many are sent into exile. They are sent into exile as colonized, defeated subjects, but they turn up in the Caribbean as privileged white bodies who join in the slave trade and join in the oppression of other colonial subjects who have been oppressed. But the difference is that these other colonial subjects are Black. So therefore, these Scots in exile don't see any joint solidarity with them. They see these people as being less than and chattel, and they join in slavery with as much enthusiasm as the English, who had for many years, and some would still argue, oppressed them. But 1833 is a moment of celebration, we say, because the enslaved people were set free. The problem is this. Although they were set free, the reformers had to do a deal with the devil, and I use that term deliberately. They had to do a deal with the devil in order to enable this act, this parliamentary act, to be passed. And it was simply this: that under British law, you cannot deprive people of their capital. You cannot take from people land or things that they have derived lawfully under British law. And because slavery was always legal, immoral, yes, but illegal, no, there was no way in which the British government could set enslaved peoples free without giving compensation to the slave owners who decreed that these enslaved peoples were indeed part of their capital. They were chattel. They were as much an owned thing as you own in land, you own in buildings, you own in capital, cattle and other livestock. You own human beings, but they're not full human beings. They are chattel. And so the abolitionists, they wrestled this for many years. They wrestled with the implications of having to do this deal. Because in doing the deal, what they were effectively admitting, having tried to argue against it for many years, is that there was indeed a value that you could put on enslaved peoples, and you could actually buy their freedom. You could redeem their freedom with monetary value. So I spent years trying to argue that these were sentient human beings, created the image and likeness of God, for whom no monetary value could be affected on them. They were forced in the end to concede that the only way in which these enslaved African people could be set free is if white owners were given compensation for them. So in 1833, the British government agrees to pay white slave owners £20 million. That's 40% of the gross domestic product of Britain. And in order to do so, they had to go to the various banks in London and take out various loans against the city on a long-term loan that was only paid back in 2015. Only paid back in 2015, which also incidentally means that every descendant of enslaved Africans like myself who have been working in Britain and paying our taxes have been paying our taxes towards the exchequer in order to pay back the money that was taken out as a loan to pay off slave owners in order to set enslaved Black people free. Just worth noting that not one penny has been given to the descendants of enslaved Africans, but money was given to the slave owners. What that then means is that essentially, even though many abolitionists tried to argue otherwise, we were indeed chattel. We were chattel for which a value could be placed on us, a monetary value could be placed on us, because we were not sentient beings, we were things. And although slavery has ended, what I would argue, and many Black academics would argue, is that sense of being a thing, that sense of not being fully human, but actually being an object, has not gone away. It is actually remained. And the thing about objects, without getting into too much deep philosophy, I was said by Barbara that one of my gifts is to try and not make things too complicated. So I will try and make it simple without making it simplistic, or certainly not to insult your intelligence. But importantly, it's important to recognize the distinction between subjects and objects. Human beings, we are subjects. And what that simply means, at its most basic, it means that like the next time you look in the mirror and you look at yourself, we have the ability to recognize ourselves and to recognize the act of knowing. So even as you are looking at yourself, you know that you're looking at yourself, and you know that's you. And you know that as you're looking at yourself, you're probably thinking lots of things. In my case, I should go on a diet and lose some weight. I should maybe do some jogging and join the gym. I should maybe see if I can get rid of this paunch that I've developed in middle age. We know that we have consciousness. And the truth is, very few animals have that. It's reckoned that only higher primates and dolphins can do that. Dogs can't do that. Put a dog in front of the mirror, the dog does not necessarily recognize itself, it sees another dog. But we are human subjects. Now, objects have no intrinsic meaning in themselves. Objects have value, but the only value they have is the value that the people who have created it or the people who use it give it. So this is a watch here. This is a watch that I bought from a second-hand shop a number of years ago. I'm told it's quite a valuable watch. It's an old accurate automatic watch of the early 70s. I'm told it's valuable. Don't know why it is, but it's valuable because enough people have agreed that it has an intrinsic value because it's made of gold and it has a handmade mechanism. The watch has no value in and of itself. The watch's only value is that which people who use it and access it determine it. That's an object. What has happened to Black people, says many scholars, and I've written about this in some of my work, is when you turn a subject into an object, you turn people who should be sentient beings, who have internal worth, who have consciousness, who have the ability to determine their own agency, to determine their own sense of well-being, their activity in the world, you turn them from subjects into as if they were some kind of inanimate object. That essentially their only value is that which people with power determine on them. And in worst case scenarios, they can maybe have no value whatsoever. And ever since the era of slavery, we have seen this continually happening. So give one very, very quick contemporary example. As we speak, there was a major book that's come out by an Oxford academic about colonialism. and its full title is Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning. And this academic has many supports, and they are arguing that colonialism, essentially, particularly practiced by the British, was quite benign. On the whole, it did some unfortunate things, but it was mainly a force for good, and it's something that we should celebrate. We should celebrate British history and celebrate the history of colonialism. And at the heart of his argument is this notion of all the things that the British people did, white British people did for people in the empire, that they should be good about, feel good about. So he talks about schools, undoubtedly good, and hospitals, undoubtedly good. The ending of various practices in various countries that were good. They brought the railways, certainly to India, that was good. All these things somehow, on the balance sheet, are a force for good against the unfortunate things that happened whilst the British were there. But here's the thing that he never ever talks about, this particular author. And the thing he never talks about is this notion of self-determination. And self-determination is simply this: irrespective of how much good you do to a group of people, and I said, I'm not saying that the British Empire did not do good things, but his utter disregard for the fact that you should put up with the indignity of someone coming to your land uninvited, making you a second, third class citizen in your own country, and then do good things to you, but good things that you never asked for them in the first place, that somehow overlooks the fact that these individuals, these so-called heathens and natives, had no agency in their own country. The only way I can explain this is to try this thought experiment. Imagine that a group of aliens come from far away and they invade Great Britain. And they come into our country, but they come with superior technology, and they come in a way that they can make everything perfect. Every social ill we've ever had will be eradicated tomorrow under their benign leadership. Only problem is that in response to all of this, we would have to submit to their superiority and let them take over the country. We know that that would never happen. British people would never, ever, ever suffer the indignity of having someone else come into their country and tell them what to do, no matter what social gains might be accrued. If the aliens came and they promised every person £20 million and as much money as we could imagine, we still wouldn't have it, because we would say, these people have no right to come into our country and tell us what to do, even irrespective of how much social good they might believe they're doing. We would never tolerate that for one moment. And yet, and here's the rub, and yet we have a major book that's written on the presumption that what British people, and by that I really mean white people, would never put up with, somehow black and brown people across the world should be grateful because we came and did good to them. The only way people can still make that argument, and that's a mainstream argument, this is not an extremist argument. Apparently, I'm the extremist for trying to argue against it, not the people who are making the argument. And the argument still gets made because intrinsically, at the heart of it is that in the same way that enslaved people had no intrinsic value, and their only value was when they were being bought effectively, and were effectively bought by the British state from their enslaved people for £20 million, is the same logic that says that people do not have the right to self-determination in their own country. A superior nation like Britain had the right to go and make them second and third class citizens, yes, not slaves, but still subservient and less than, with no intrinsic value, no worth that allowed them to determine their own self-determination, but essentially they had to fall into line and accept someone else as being superior. Therefore, once you're working with a logic that says that certain bodies have no intrinsic value in and of themselves, it then, I'm afraid to say, it's really a bit of a hop, skip, and a jump then, to go from that to say, well, actually, murdering such an individual is not the worst thing in the world. And it's worth remembering, if we take ourselves back to 30 years, the first instinct of the Metropolitan Police was not to find the white killers, but was to investigate and charge one of the black friends, because intrinsically, black people must be to blame for their own deaths. And initially, the movement of the media was to try to find some moral blame. Somehow this individual must have done something wrong in order to precipitate his own death. It's only after they had tried the moral blame, it's only after they had found that there was no extenuating circumstances to justify his death, did they then turn around and say, well, actually, maybe this was an unfortunate death of an innocent person. If that sounds rather callous as I'm describing it, I have to remind you, they did the exact same thing with George Floyd. When he died, the first thing they did is to dig into his character and to say, is there something that he did that made him deserve these police officers like to sit on his neck, on his chest, squeeze the air out of him as he was crying for his mum. So we are dealing with a dynamic, certainly within Western philosophical thought, that still sees Black presence as problematic. So much so that when you have a movement called Black Lives Matter, which in a sense is kind of absurd, it's an absurdity to need to have a movement to say that lives matter when all lives should matter. And even when Black Lives Matter, what we've got are somehow then a white parasitic group turning up and saying, yeah, but all lives matter. Why should Black lives matter? Well, Black lives matter because they've never mattered. Since 1833 and £20 million being given to set free human beings who should have never been enchained in the first place, our lives have not mattered. So in response to this, as a theologian, I want to counter this dynamic with a Christian truth that we all know is true, but just because it's true doesn't mean that it's necessarily been practiced. And this truth really comes from God's self as a Christian theologian. That's the Imago Dei, that's the image of God. That in our traditional Christian teaching, we say that the image of God is bound up with humanity. All humanity is created in the image and likeness of God. Every time we look at a human being, we see echoes of God's presence, of God's creative genius that created us in God's image in the first place. That bound up with God and God's identity is this notion of God being holy. Holy sin is a key characteristic of God, that God is worthy of our devotion, and to be identified as holy is to be set apart for God's purposes alone, i.e. holy isn't meant to be ordinary. And when we think about people who are pursuing holiness, we often have images of individuals withdrawing from the world, often leading secluded and separate lives as a means of remaining faithful and committed to a holy God. Oftentimes, being holy or pursuing holiness is often characterized by what we do not do. So, for example, growing up in the Methodist tradition as a Methodist, there were strict prohibitions against gambling and drinking. I did not take up drinking until I left home, age 18, to go to university. And that's the first time I ever went to a pub, first time I ever went to a bar, because I grew up in a teetotal household. I also grew up in a context where one did not gamble. And the truth is, I still do not gamble. I did buy some national lottery tickets when they first came out for about the first 3 months, and I felt really bad about it. I felt incredibly guilty and have not bought a lottery ticket since. That is part of my own experience of growing up within a holiness tradition. But as I've grown older, I've increasingly come to see, and it's not just me, many people have said that holiness is also a social phenomenon, in that it's also embedded in the world. It's not seeking to be out of the world, it's not seeking to withdraw from it, but it's about trying to transform the whole of the world to become holy and to make it fit for God's purposes. So seeing a holy God connected to the world, seeking to transform it into the likeness of God, It requires that those of us who are committed to God are deeply engaged in the world. This brings me to what I think is the thing that's often hidden in plain sight. The central to Christian practice over centuries has been the practice of Holy Communion. Now, whatever our differing church traditions and theologies surrounding what we think happens when we pray over bread and wine, and scholars have wrestled with this, and I'm not going to bore you with all the intricate arguments around what we think happens or doesn't happen around bread and wine. But what we all believe, largely speaking, is that something happens. That these ordinary things of the world, that somehow God is amazingly present in the ordinary things of this world, in bread and wine. That they become for us holy. In and of themselves, they're not holy, they're just objects. In the same way, this watch is just an object, bread is just an object, and wine is just an object. What makes it valuable, sometimes it's depending on what kind of bread it is. Is it expensive, fancy, seeded wholemeal from a fancy shop, or is it plain, bog standard, white, processed, milled bread? What kind of wine is it? Is it nice, expensive Beaujolais, or is it cheap plonk from like the local supermarket for $1.99 that tastes more like vinegar? That depends upon whether you're a connoisseur or not. In and of itself, it's not valuable. It's what we determine about it. It's an object. And yet when a priest or holy hands, whatever we believe or understand by that presence, prays over bread and wine, we say it becomes for us the body and blood of Jesus Christ. God is present in it. Here's a radical idea, not original idea by any means. So I'm not pretending any of this is Anthony Reddie's original thoughts when he woke up this morning. This is my attempt to use Christian theology to help us to get at what is this ongoing problem around how we see Black bodies. As a Black liberation theologian, I'm firmly committed to the belief that God infuses humanity with God's presence, so rendering humanity holy. This is particularly the case for those bodies that have been intrinsically and historically seen as less than, seen as disposable, or even worse, as chattel, as commodity. If God can transform bread and wine into something special and holy, then I believe that this God is committed to doing the same things for those bodies that are considered wretched and disposable. Black liberation theology asserts that Black bodies are holy, that our dark skin, which has been often marked out as something to be pitied or attacked, is special, something through which God's presence is to be found. Louis Armstrong wrote a very famous tune in the late 1920s. And in the tune, it has very few words, but the words are, "What did I do to be made so black and blue?" What did I do to be made so black and blue? And what Louis Armstrong is saying in that song, something that many African Americans and many Black people at the time and to this day would still lament on, is what did we do to be made so rendered, so disposable, and so unimportant, simply by the accident of being born into the wrong skin? What did I do to be made so black and blue? Black liberation theology, of which I am a participant in, an activist in, a scholar who's tried to write in that tradition, says that God is revealed in our Blackness. God is revealed through Black suffering, through the midst of all that limits us as human beings, as Black people, as human beings, that consigns us as chattel, that denies us agency, that says that self-determination, our desire to want to be free and to make our own decisions, not controlled by other people, that all those things that seem somehow aberrant and seem somehow impossible in a world dominated by white supremacy, that in the midst of all of that, God is revealed. And God is revealed as much in black suffering as God is in red and white. That black bodies are holy. So once we believe that despised black bodies are holy, then our attitude to black people, indeed the very concept of blackness itself, must change. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And yet, as I said, in 2020, we saw the murder of George Floyd. So clearly nothing had been significantly learned within white-dominated societies. In two different contexts, two black men, very different in personalities and life experiences, we see the casual disregard for black bodies. In both contexts, what we also see are some white conservative Christians happen to pronounce that they are committed to an abstract holy God they can't see, but have no commitment to black bodies that they can see. There is no holiness that does not have social implications. All holiness is not just about how we withdraw from the world and are committed to an abstract God. It's also about how we live and how we are engaged in the world, and in what ways are we trying to transform systems and structures that have historically placed values on some bodies as being value, as having value and importance, but yet are seen other bodies as being of little significance, to the point where they can be murdered seemingly with impunity. That, in my view, there's no way that we can be holy in the abstract. Rather, being holy requires us to be connected to the ordinary and the everyday, including and especially it's a connectedness to those bodies and those people the world considers disposable or of little or no use. One cannot be considered holy or be committed to a holy God if we believe, for example, that asylum seekers don't matter. If we can use language about them that suggests that these people are somehow vermin, or that somehow they do not belong within the body politic of polite so-called Christian people in a so-called Christian nation. I.e., holy is a deeply political and social enterprise, and is not a singular abstract or remote concept. If inanimate objects can be considered holy, then I believe that sentient beings can also be considered holy as well. And I think especially those that are in black skin and those that have historically been seen as chattel and seen as commodities and seen as people without agency or without any will to self-determination, that God is revealed in the midst of their suffering. The challenge, therefore, as I sum up, is how do we reflect on the legacies of Stephen Lawrence? If he hadn't have died, I suspect that he may have lived a long life and be very anonymous. That most of us don't end up being famous. That most of us don't end up having our names in the paper or being seen in the media. And the truth is, his family would have been delighted if he had been able to live a life. Even if it had been anonymous, he would still be a human subject who would have made his own choices and made his own decisions and lived a life based on self-determination that all of us should be able to do as a gift of God. But that was snatched away from him. And the irony is that in being turned into an object of hate, in some respects, is almost become immortal. I suspect in another 20 years' time, we will still be remembering his death. it is my hope that his death will be a sacramental one that will remind us of the significance and the need to hold all bodies as holy, especially and including those of us who live in a black skin. Thank you.
It is really challenging, but it's also inspiring. And it's wonderful that you speak in a way which is understandable and kind of cuts through everything to the heart. And I love that. So thank you so much. Sometimes we can be overwhelmed with the problems. We know what awful problems there have been resulting from what you've been talking about. We know all that. And then we're stuck in it somehow. But because you related it all the way through to what God makes holy, I love that it isn't just bread and wine which becomes holy through God's grace. It's people. I love that. And it makes me think that maybe one of the things we can do more of is remembering that at every communion, every Eucharist. But modeling the kind of change that we want to see is another thing, of course. And also carrying on with all the big stuff where we feel pretty rubbish, but then what does that matter? Thank you for inspiring us. And thank you for sharing with us so openly. It's wonderful. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your engagement and attentive listening. Thank you.